Luis Felipe, I'm very honored to introduce you today. It is my I'm deeply honored. He is currently the co-director of the World Bank World Development Report in 2017 on governance and the law. Luis Felipe previously served as lead economist and regional poverty advisor for the World Bank Europe and Central Asia region, and as the lead economist at the Poverty, Equity, and Gender Unit in the bank's Latin American and Caribbean region. He has also served as chief economist for Latin American and the Caribbean at UNDP in New York, and has been a visiting scholar at the Standard Center for International Development and Stanford University, and at the World Institute for Development Economics Research in Helsinki. Luis Felipe has a master's in economics from Boston University and a master's and PhD in economics from Cornell University. He has taught at the Universidad de las Américas, Puebla, and El Colegio de México. He is a fellow of the Human Development and Capabilities Association and associate editor of the Journal of Human Development and Capabilities. Given his commitment to human development, his long-standing experience with active networks on similar activities, and his leadership position in the World Bank, we are delighted that in addition to these accolades, Luis Felipe is a warm and trusted friend of the MPPN. Please join me in giving a heartfelt welcome to Mr. Luis Felipe Lopez Calva.
Thank you very much. That was a very generous introduction. Thank you for that. And thank you for the opportunity to address this audience. We're going to take this opportunity mainly to give a little bit of background on the conceptual elements behind the multidimensional measurement. And I want to give like with Kimberly Bolch, who is here with me, we thought it was important to tell you a little bit about the evolution of the thinking within the bank and the importance of the Atkinson report that was released a few weeks ago. Because I think this is an important context for the type of meeting we're having today. So, I mean, we will make the presentation available. I see that I should have used a larger font, but so first we want to talk a little bit about the conceptual foundations for the MPI, and then to put the Atkinson report in that context. And finally, talk a little bit of how we see as how important the MPI is, not only for measurement, but actually for policy, where some of the policy features that make the MPI a particularly relevant tool. So in terms of the more conceptual framework, you know, it was really in the 80s, particularly with Commodities and Capabilities, the book by Amartya Sen, that we started, you know, all this discussion about where is the space in which we should measure social achievement. So the idea that, you know, traditional welfare economics said, well, we have to measure it in the space of utility, and then the question there was, well, the access to resources is actually only a necessary condition, but actually individuals have to transform that access to goods and services and resources into functionings. And I think that is the key concept, because then this idea of the beings and doings, so being educated, being healthy, participating in the community, all these doings and beings that are made available to people for which the access to resources is only a condition, a precondition, but it's not enough. And then we can think about how this is assessed, and it depends there, and where the agency part is very important, is how, you know, people can choose. If these functionings are available, people can choose the life plans they have reasons to value. And I think this is a completely different way of approaching social advancement compared to the traditional welfare economics approach. And yet, for many years, you know, in many institutions, including the World Bank, the welfare economics approach, the traditional welfare economics approach, has dominated when it comes to measuring poverty. I want to how ideas are transformed eventually into policy, it takes some time. But I want to mention some key milestones that we think have been very important in the World Bank to start moving in a different direction. So one is certainly the poverty report, the World Development Report of 2001, which had a full section on empowerment and all the project on voices of the poor and so on, that started to bring a very different way to think about poverty. Then in 2004, there was a World Development Report on service delivery, which was controversial at the time, but then it really brought the idea of accountability and voice as fundamental elements constitutive of poverty. Then the 2006 World Development Report on equity, which by a particular definition of equity related to equality of opportunity that we now think is a bit too conservative, but that approach legitimized the discussion about inequality within the bank, which was more focused on growth. And since then, we have definitely incorporated much more the discussion on inequality. Then the WDR 2017 that we're launching in January, in which we try to actually do a similar type of exercise, but talking about power asymmetries. So basically what we try to do in that report is to show how the distribution of power in society in very specific ways matters to make the system more responsive to the needs and interests of specific groups, and in that sense how poverty and equity are closely related with those power asymmetries. And we plan to have a very broad dissemination strategy, so we really try to change the way people think about these elements. But in this context, it's also very important that the previous chief economist, Kaushik Basu, asked for an independent commission to rethink the way we measure poverty. And then, so there was, the Atkinson Commission was appointed, and in which there were 23 leading scholars, thinkers in this area. The commission was chaired by Sir Anthony Atkinson, and the idea was completely independent of how the bank works, to try to come up with ideas and recommendations in two areas. One is on how to monitor extreme poverty, and the other is whether we should engage in additional exercises or complementary indicators to measure poverty. The report has been presented a few weeks ago, and in the report there are many recommendations, and the bank has responded also. So along with the presentation of the report, there is a response by the bank saying which recommendations are going to be taken by the bank immediately, and which recommendations need a little bit more of discussion within the bank. So, for example, the idea that the poverty line should be expressed in local currency, the idea of strengthening the way prices are monitored and so on. All those elements have been taken immediately. There are others that are under discussion, for example, replacing the PPP adjustment for monetary poverty and using domestic changes in prices is something that is still being discussed, so it has not been adopted formally by the bank already. But then some of them that are very relevant, that are very relevant are recommendations number 11, 18, and 19, in which basically the Commission says that the bank must complement monetary poverty measures with either a dashboard with other dimensions, and in recommendations 18 and 19 is more explicitly with a multidimensional approach to measurement. And I think here one element is very important because it has created, I think, confusion even within the bank and outside the bank. It is very different. So in the bank, people tend to say, we are already doing multidimensional because we always show profiles of the poor, and we look at other dimensions and how the individuals are doing in terms of other dimensions. But I think the issue that James Foster explained in the presentation in OFI last week, and I think it's very important, is the identification is what matters. So the point is not to measure poverty, identify the poor using a monetary measure, and then looking at other dimensions. The recommendation is to identify the poor using a multidimensional approach, which is a very different way to do it. And for that, the bank has explicitly stated that the class of indices as the Alcaire-Foster index should be used to try to aggregate these dimensions. Of course, then the next steps, and which is something that is now under discussion within the bank, there is a specific task force looking into this. The critical steps, of course, is to look at which dimensions will be used, how they are going to be aggregated at the end, if it's going to be an index like the Alcaire-Foster or some other, even though in the statement it's explicitly mentioned that that class of index is the one that we should be using. And finally, the discussion that is very relevant about the weights, how to weight the different dimensions into one indicator. And this is a discussion that we always have. So the next, the bank has now a series of, every year we'll present a report monitoring the evolution of the reduction in poverty and what we call the shared prosperity indicator, which is the growth, the income growth for the bottom 40% of the population. So the report for next year, which will be presented in October 2017, will also advance in the presentation of how the bank is already adopting these recommendations in the Atkinson report. So certainly the idea that having this dashboard, there are 4 groups or 4 broad dimensions the bank has stated that will be incorporated. One of them is educational outcomes, the other has to do with access to healthcare, and the other has to do with access to basic services. Now, which indicators and how they will be presented is what is under discussion now. If only a multidimensional measure is considered, it has been the advantage of the complete ranking, and we can also have measures of intensity of well-being. As we know, another recommendation of the Atkinson report is that we should start also monitoring the gap of poverty, not only the headcount of poverty, which I think is very important for the type of incentives or policy response that triggers. So in the case of multidimensional, we can use actually the headcount, but also the intensity. So that's a major advantage. One of the main issues under discussion now is that if we want to use that kind of measurement, we need to have the information all in the same survey. And the idea is, what is the type of surveys that would allow us to actually have that type of information for all individuals and try to aggregate for as many countries as possible. And I think that is one of the main challenges. If we only use the dashboard approach, then some of these issues would be solved, because now you don't need to have all the information from the same source and so on. You don't need to choose the weights, but in that case, you will not have complete rankings, and there are issues related to the joint distribution of the characteristics. Most likely, the bank will actually combine and adopt both a dashboard in which the evolution of certain indicators is shown, but also an aggregate measure, very likely of the Alcaire-Foster class. So this is where the discussion is right now in the bank, and we wanted to, so as I said, give you a little bit of context, show you what kind of recommendations we received from the Commission, what the bank is doing right now to adopt those recommendations. But I want to say that this is more at the, as Sabina just mentioned, that what the action is at the country level. So this is the discussion in terms of the global monitoring, and this is going to take some time to actually reach some specific decisions for that. And as I said, the report next year will bring some of these elements. But the action, as Sabina said, is at the country level. So this is only the case of the region of Latin America, and you can see how about 2/3 of the countries in Latin America are now either adopting or considering to adopt a multidimensional measure. Some of the countries that were mentioned in the previous presentation that recently adopted an MPI are in the Latin American region. So I can tell you that even though the bank, in terms of the global monitoring, we are discussing the Atkinson recommendations, we are facing a demand by countries to go in that direction, and the bank is responding at the country level with support in this area. So in that sense, the bank is already heavily involved and pursuing this agenda at the country level, which I consider a very important advancement in the way the bank works in this area. So 3 final points that we believe are very important, because a multidimensional poverty measurement is not only about measurement, and this is something very important, and I think this is something that this type of network shows, that it's not only about measurement. So one is the issue of how, for example, by presenting headcount and intensity, we provide certain incentives for policymakers to address the issue of poverty in a more comprehensive way. The issue that how we know very well the cases of Mexico and Colombia, but there are others, how the multidimensional measurement has helped policy coordination, which I think is a very important aspect of the multidimensional measurement that sometimes is not considered appropriately. It is a very powerful instrument of policy coordination. And finally, I think this broader conceptualization of poverty makes it easier to bring other elements into the discussion, in the sense that if poverty is not only about generating income or getting income transfers, but it's actually about a multidimensional interaction with the state and with the communities, then the way in which the project we are launching now as a follow-up of the WDR, which is how people experience the state, in the sense how people build the notion of how they belong to the social contract by the interactions individuals and households have with the different areas of service provision from the state, and how, if we inform the policy design from that perspective, policy making can also be done in a way not only that meets the needs of service provision and so on, but also with a perspective that by doing that, it's also building, strengthening citizenship and increasing social cohesion around a specific social contract. So I think the type of possibilities in terms of the policy discussion that an MPI brings is the type of dialogue that we expect to have in a network like this. So we wanted to use this as an introduction to that, and we are ready to respond to any questions you may have on how the bank will be working with as a follow-up in the adoption of the Atkinson report. Thank you very much for the opportunity again to OFI.
Thank you, Luis.